Hello everyone, I'm Fola. Welcome to the 5th episode of the Diversifying Research Podcast. This is a podcast where we amplify the voices of underrepresented individuals who are either involved in research themselves or engage other underrepresented groups in research. Over the course of this limited podcast series, we'll critically consider how to improve the inclusion of underrepresented voices in research. During this episode, we're joined again by the amazing De-Shaine Murray, who is a Black Caribbean PhD student. He was featured on the last podcast episode where he spoke about his experiences navigating academia. And over the course of this episode, we're going to speak to De-Shaine about access and outreach, because an important way of improving representation in academia is about diversifying student recruitment and outreach and enabling students from disadvantaged backgrounds to study at academic institutions. So De-Shaine is going to speak about why he got involved in access and outreach, pathways to higher education, and how access is currently being carried out at academic institutions and if it needs to change. Hello De-Shaine, how are you?
Hi there, Fola. I'm very good, thank you. It's nice to be here with you again.
Awesome. It's a really nice experience for me too, because I loved recording the last podcast. So for those who didn't tune into the last podcast, could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So as said before, my name is De-Shaine Murray. I'm a second year PhD student at Imperial College London, and I'm in the field of neurotechnology. So essentially, this is anything to do with the brain and linking that directly to technology. And specifically, my project looks at the brain when it is injured in cases of traumatic brain injury and stroke, and actually building and fabricating devices that can monitor changes and potentially proliferation of that injury as it goes along. So that's essentially what I'm doing now at Imperial. And yeah, that's me.
That sounds like really impactful research. Thanks for the introduction. So you've been heavily involved in access and outreach over the years. Can you explain some of the activities you've been involved in?
Sure. So I've always had that, outlook in terms of, especially now that I was getting to this stage, I've wanted to give back in some way. It's partly because I just know just how difficult it is. It's funny because if I talk about outreach and even just representing culturally, I've actually been doing this from school. So in my school days, we didn't have anything to do really with Black History Month. It was very poorly represented. But I actually asked one, but after getting into sixth form and getting really sick of just seeing year after year just a poor showing being done, I actually set up during a Black History Week, we set up an event, so like a proper student event that was essentially a showcase. And I think that was really the start for me, of showing that it could be done. And even though this is only a school level, we did it for charity and raised a little bit of money. This is essentially like just the beginning. And from there, I didn't do much during my undergraduate, but really when I came to Imperial, it was about, for me, showing kids that essentially you may have had it difficult and had it hard, but there are people that you can look up to and you can essentially do the same as what we've done, but also do more. So when I first came to Imperial, the first organization I started working with was the Amos Bursary. So I actually did some work there as a peer mentor, and I'm still a peer mentor. Essentially with the Amos Bursary scheme, they have peer mentors and professional mentors. So we were paired up with a student, and that student who I've been paired up with is currently at University of East Anglia and is doing his pharmacy degree. So very proud of him and wishing him all the best with that. And we keep in touch every now and then just to check on his progress. But yeah, that was enough for me, because it's important to mentor. But I think outreach in general, especially when it's done on an institutional level, has an issue with actually being directly involved or in the communities that it's trying to serve. So I got involved with a program that was already existing, which is known as Elite Scientists. And essentially that program looks at you as a PhD student going into school, giving a talk, basically discussing your research, and then having students at that school then apply and be part of an after-school club, essentially, that runs every Tuesday or so, with the view to then actually carry out a research project and bring that research back to Imperial such that it can be showcased. And had it not been for COVID this year, the students that I had been looking after would have presented at the Great Exhibition Road Festival. So I guess the first thing I'll say with that is shout out to Miss Kapila, who was doing this beforehand. And yeah, so I took on that role. But the cool thing about that is essentially for this year or for the upcoming academic year, we plan to have this same scheme, but in 4 schools across that same foundation. So this was William Perkins School, but we're sending it around the whole foundation. So that'd be to Ada Lovelace, that'd be to Ealing Fields. I've forgotten the name of the other school, name escapes me at the moment. But essentially, they'll be at all 4 institutions. And as I mentioned in the previous episode about the African Caribbean Research Collective, I'm actually calling on members of that group to actually do that outreach too. So it's how we sort of facilitate that in and bring role models directly to schools. That's just the beginning. But I've done a lot more outreach, but I'll stop talking for now.
That sounds really impressive. How old are the young people involved in the Elite Scientists program?
Sure. So they are between the ages of 11 to 13. So this is year 7 to 9. And I had no control over this because this was the scheme that I went into before, but I've seen that that's really quite a good age to intervene. When school is new, there's potentially lots of different things that a child can get involved with and get interested in, both positively and negatively. I think it's good at that early stage of secondary school to kind of form a love for science and form a love for just getting involved in research and seeing or demystifying what it is to be a scientist. And funny enough, when I'm there with my students, I think they just appreciate the fact that I'm just there to talk to them and see them as the person of the child that they are. And they can see me as the person that I am. It's not a case of, oh, he's a scientist or he's wearing this lab coat or he's wearing this suit or he's this or that. Essentially, I try to be like a peer with them. Obviously, there is still that respect and that difference, but they see that it's not that hard to get to where I am. And that visibility is very much important. So yeah, essentially it's 11 to 13-year-olds that we do that work with.
I love that you're targeting that age group because I myself have been involved in access and outreach, but it was always done at year 12 and year 13. But actually, the formative years, as you said, are between the ages of 11 and 13. Thinking back to some of the exclusion statistics, a lot of young people tend to get excluded between year 9 and year 10. So I guess if you can target them earlier on, that could be really impactful. So it's great to see that. But also just thinking about pathways to higher education, once these young people finish the Elite Scientist scheme, is there some sort of pathway, something they can do next that then keeps them interested in science or not?
So at the moment, especially in those schools, no. I would say that's definitely a wider goal of mine. I think the hardest thing is just there are so many schools that need this, for one. And it's just how do you grow something like this effectively, sustainably, but have the manpower to do it? And I think that's something, again, that we'll probably end up discussing later, but it's just about outreach's role in terms of wider academia and how it's really not incentivized properly or no emphasis is put on it. I think it's put on later on when you get to the staff level, the postdoc level and beyond. But even at the PhD level, why are we not encouraging our students to get involved with the communities that potentially will be affected by the research that they do? So I think that's a very important thing and something that needs to be dealt with and addressed. But yes, at the moment, there are no direct pathways. But where I've got involved elsewhere is one with, well, not just the Amos Bursary, as I mentioned before, the mentor, but I did a bit of work with Generating Genius, which essentially I did a speed networking event there that was aimed at A-level students and really just showing what a professional mentor was like. Also done some work with Young Gifted in STEM. So shout out to Genevieve Bent, who runs that from South London schools, and essentially did an online campaign with them. And I think the work that she's doing there is really going to grow and do really well. Again, that's probably aimed at a few of the later years, so probably like year 9, year 10, and when people are making the transition to sixth form. And in addition to that, the Reach Society too, which is where actually I did a lot of my outreach directly through Imperial. So again, another shout out to Wayne Mitchell, so Dr. Wayne Mitchell, who's an Imperial academic and has done a lot of work on this front way before I even got on the scene. But he invited me to do some work with the Reach Society, which was actually at a careers conference. And essentially, I think it was up to 13,000 people attended that event over the course of the day. And we really just were trying to dispel myths, show that Imperial is a place that they could potentially come to. And again, had it not been for COVID, we would have been running that same thing again this year, but with more students. But since that point, essentially, we've been doing a lot of work in collaboration with the Reach Society, also with Imperial as one, where I actually did a Windrush event, which again was aimed at undergraduates actually, and then also those that are looking to make the jump from sixth form to undergraduate, but also from undergraduate to postgraduate. So essentially, I'm trying to do as much as I can across the board, but it's hard to do that as one person and also complete a PhD, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you definitely seem to be doing a lot. I just wanted to touch on the point you made about the Afro-Caribbean Research Collective getting involved in the work that the elite scientists are doing. How important is it to have people of Afro-Caribbean descent basically go into schools, go into local communities and say, hey, I'm a scientist, you can do this as well? What truly is the impact of that?
This is a good question, but the way I would put it is throughout my own career, growing up and going through academia, I had a lack of role models or someone to look directly up to who was in the field or wanted to do what I did. So that made it much harder to navigate or to know what I wanted to do. And visibility is key and representation really matters. So essentially with linking those two things together, you're bringing Black scientists directly to schools, which would potentially have more Black people. I would say that this outreach is not specific just to Black people. We do work with people across BAME and also with white working class students. So it's not that is that directly, but when you see a Black scientist that's going directly into schools which may have higher Black populations and the effect that that will have on a student, and I've even seen it myself, just how positive an effect it can have. I think that's very important. And I think the Afro-Caribbean Research Collective always had that outward-looking mentality that we wanted to go and be a part of our community and potentially lead to some change. With that, we're also currently recording a wave of YouTube videos, which we're going to let out, talking about barriers to access and how to get over them, how to navigate a PhD, how to get to a PhD, how to apply for a PhD. Because there's so much that lots of students do not know and lots of things that I learned on the job. So I learned as I was getting through. But if you can bring people like us and bring them directly to these students and show them that this is the way and that it is possible, and give them a visible mentor, visible something to look up to, you'll see changes very quickly. That's essentially what the aim is there. So it's about bringing that together and really, I guess, joining together the pipeline, because there are lots of things happening in different places, but it needs to be cohesive and coordinated and build up. Definitely.
And you just mentioned the barriers to access and advising students on how to overcome those barriers. Of course, we can't have a whole conversation about it in just a 30-minute podcast, but I'm mindful that there's some Afro-Caribbean students listening to the podcast who might want to know what those barriers are and how they can overcome it. So could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's so much, it's just like where to start. So you have financial barriers, that's one thing. And we know this from even recent research and studies and articles that have come out showing just how, in terms of, well, for every white household that has £1, the Black Caribbean household will have, I think it's either 20 or 30 pence, and then a Black African household will have 20 or 10 pence. I don't remember exactly what it was, but essentially from there you see the stark differences. So if student finance, maybe someone can afford an undergraduate, but when we're looking to postgraduate level, how many Black students are going to be able to afford the upfront cost for a master's without having or getting a scholarship and that help? It shows you very quickly that there is a barrier financially straight away. A lot of us as Black students, whether Black Caribbean or Black African, have had to grow up where during our studies we've worked and we've supported ourselves financially because we've had to. There was no other way. I know of a lot of people that are in that position. That in itself is an added burden or stress, which will impact on us getting the grades that we can because we're having to juggle. That's just on a financial level. We can talk about access in terms of experience and in terms of placements. Now, from what I've seen, and this is academia, but it was also when I had initially applied to medicine when I was going to do my undergraduate, there are barriers to access with regards to getting the work experience that you need to even do the application. So if you don't know a doctor or someone very high up in the NHS, how are you going to get your placement in order to then go and study medicine? And that works in various different fields. It's not just medicine. So I've seen it in myself in academia that people will get access to labs at a very young age and form that love for research just on the basis that they know a professor or they know a senior academic. And that senior academic can be like, yeah, come shadow me for a week, come work in my research group. Now, if there are no or little Black professors, as we know that the stats are very bad, it's less than 1%. There are 90 Black male professors, and I think there are 27 Black female professors in the UK. And that's out of around 20,000 places. If there's no one there to then say, okay, yeah, come do a placement with me, how do you then recruit the next set of students and people that want to do research? So I think there are loads of barriers. There's even the barrier with regards to how you frame an application such that an academic is going to read it and understand you in the words that you want, because you may not speak in the way that they speak. It doesn't mean that you are any way less intelligent. It's just about how you then form these things. So there are a hell of a lot of barriers. This could be a whole conversation, a whole episode in itself. But it's just about beginning to show that and dispel those myths, things that a lot of us learn on the job, a lot of us learn along the way, but show that it can be navigated. It just needs a little bit of finesse.
And some people might be in sixth form or secondary school and might want these experiences, but don't know about institutions that they can reach out to or organizations that can help. Can you advise and just name a few, not to put you on the spot?
No, that's absolutely fine. So one I would say is really good is Leading Roots, and not just because of the activism work that they have done, but resultingly what they've done with Black in Academia events, where essentially they've set up conferences which are directed or dedicated to having people at the PhD level and beyond, postdoc level, and lecturers and academics essentially telling you about their own experiences and dispelling those myths. So that's Black in Academia. Then, in addition to that, they do Future Scholars Program, which is really just coaching and getting students at that level when they're beginning to do applications and trying to form that for them and helping them and fixing that pipeline and bringing them to that. So Leading Roots is definitely one. The Reach Society, I would say, is another, just because of the careers conferences, the networking. There's so much that's being done by that group, and that work needs to continue to be supported. Young Gifted in STEM, which is growing, and there's some really good work that's being done there. But essentially, I would say for a lot of students that are considering, whether it be undergraduate or postgraduate, is try and find those people, reach out to us, because the worst thing that will happen is we'll say no, we'll say we can't talk to you at that point, but get some idea or some understanding of what the process is like and ask questions. If you don't ask, you don't get, unfortunately. So until we are more visible, and we're working on that, as I said, with things like YouTube videos and all these conferences, hopefully when they go back to being in person over the course of hopefully the next year or so, yeah, just be active and really seek out and try and plan your future in that respect, because essentially by consulting us, by finding people like us and learning from us, you'll not have to make a lot of the mistakes that we had made, or not have to deal with some of the barriers that we had made, because you'll go in essentially like with a lamp into a dark room, whereas we were in the dark room. So that's what I would say to that.
Definitely. And even if someone hasn't been involved in access or outreach programs, there are 5 options you can put down on your university application. You might as well put one down, because the only way to guarantee that you don't get into these institutions is if you don't apply. So, De-Shaine, I would really love to get your take on decolonisation movements, because there is a notion within subjects and disciplines which aren't the social sciences that those subjects can't be decolonised, because there is this view that if a topic relates to science, technology, engineering, or maths, it's somehow sort of objective and hasn't been tainted in any way by colonialism. So what is your take on it?
I'll be respectful, sure, but I am quite opinionated on this, and it's the fact that it's not the case. It's one, science is not apolitical, and two, it definitely does need to be decolonised, because a lot of the ideas that persist from the past have actually come from the sciences, and academia, as I've said, is knowledge dissemination. So it's something that comes from the top down, and it's often the thinkers of the time that will define what is then perpetuated in the societies of the time. So we actually touched on this, funny enough, in Black in Neuro, and essentially the classifications of race and those divisions in the first place, which actually came from a French physician known as Francois Bernier. Now, if you don't have stuff like that, if you don't have things like Origin of the Species from Darwin, which essentially, well, great seminal work, but it was used to show the inferiority of Black people, then you have eugenicism in general. You have phrenology, even though that was a very short period of time and it was dispelled. But trying to say that Black people had different parts of their brains that were smaller than white people's or were different sized, and that meant that they could be inferior to white people. Essentially, a lot of these things have persisted and come from science, and they have not been removed from the two. So why do we teach science in a vacuum? It should be taught with the context of its time. It's funny because Imperial, which has recently looked into its own history and is beginning to, has done so with Delabecq, and the Delabecq Medal, which was given here at Imperial to geologists, and the Delabecq Society, which has now since been renamed. Essentially, Delabecq was the son of a slave owner I've forgotten the exact area, but I think it's somewhere in St. Catherine in Jamaica. And I know of people who are from that area. That cannot be removed, and that context cannot be split apart, because essentially the wealth that allowed Henry Delabecq to go across the world and do his research came from slavery. So, yeah, science needs to be able to have these conversations. Even the Industrial Revolution, the money that came for James Watt's research, where did that come from? I'll leave viewers to find that out. But essentially, across the board, you look at the sugar trade with the transatlantic slave trade, you look at the cotton trade, and then where this money was used and how that came into science research. Essentially, across the board, we need to start having these conversations and decolonizing it by saying science has had this history, whether or not you choose to agree with it, which you shouldn't be agreeing with anyway, but we have to accept and acknowledge that this has happened. And what are we going to deal with that? How are we going to teach science such that it is put within the context of its time, that people know exactly what happened, and the fact that there are potential dangers if we don't learn from those mistakes from before? Because in my field, in the field of neuroscience, things like AI, essentially this science can still be used to disproportionately affect Black people in some way. What about bias in the training of AI? Essentially, if you have a data set with artificial intelligence that has not been trained on Black faces, it will falsely identify them and falsely identify them at a high rate. And the Metropolitan Police has recently released something like that in London. Has that been properly trained on a data set that has included Black people, such that they're not falsely identified and stopped? When myself, as a young Black man, I'm 9 times more likely to be stopped by the police than a white person. So these are the conversations that need to be had. And most importantly, it boils down to having diverse workforces. It boils down to having people in the room that are able to challenge science. And that's the whole point of science in general and academia, is when we put out research, it is peer reviewed. But if we're peer reviewing it by the same pool of people, the same homogenous pool of people who replicate or reproduce these same ideas, then that in itself is bias. I could talk for England about that. But
Yeah. No, you've made some really, really valid points. And what I think would be very insightful is if you let us know what you think as a Black student, if the curriculum, but also the wider academic and societal environment is decolonized, what would the impact be and how would it change the way you navigate these institutions?
Sure. Well, I guess I can only really speak on my own experiences and my own struggles with this, which is essentially, as a Black student, you are not just doing this for yourself. It's a sad thing where you cannot just be an individual. With a lot of the stereotypes that are put on us, you often have to bear the brunt in a lot of these institutions where essentially you're the only representation. So I've had this conversation with my flatmates where they only have to focus on their research. I focus on my research, but I focus on outreach. I focus on mentorship and running support groups. And essentially the onus is not on anybody else to do this but myself. I know of many people, even at Imperial, someone like Medina Wayne, who's had to do exactly the same thing as a Black female. So when you have this pressure in academia because you don't see anyone trying to make these changes, but you know that the changes are needed, it's a very difficult thing. I think I said it in the previous episode. If you have disparities in healthcare, such that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, if you have disparities in justice and the prison system, where I, as a black person, am 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. I think I'm 4 times more likely to be arrested. I'm 3 times more likely to die in police custody. These sorts of disparities, what do they point to? They point to an unfair society. They point to something that needs to change. But who is doing the change? And a lot of us, especially as young students, we're having to bear the brunt in our own fields, in the field of academia, even with the attainment gap, which is really the awarding gap, and the disparities there between black and white students. There is so much that needs to be done, but again, that needs to be supported institutionally.
And as you said, the onus is on students like yourself who are having to juggle a lot of things. And do you think institutions can be better at remunerating people like yourself? Not necessarily just financially, but we've spoken previously about how it's hard for people like you in particular to progress on from undergraduate education to postgraduate education. So do you think there can be incentives in place that actually mean that as much as you're giving back to academic institutions, they're also giving back to you?
Yeah, most definitely. I think there's very easy things that can be done in that front. And yeah, it doesn't just have to be financial, but for outreach, people need to be paid in some way, because it's a lot of time that is given out. And it, as we've said, is often by underrepresented minorities who know the struggles for getting underrepresented minorities in through the door. But that in itself takes its toll. So yes, financial is one of the things. Secondly, it's time and actually supporting these initiatives that exist and actually building on them with the manpower. I cannot, as a black student, go to every single school in London. And it would be nice to see that even just, not just research groups, but amongst our peers, of that willingness to chip in and to join in, because still your experience as a postgraduate is valuable to a student, whether they're an underrepresented minority or not, because they're seeing it, they're getting an idea of what it is to walk in your shoes. And that's something academia at the moment, in my opinion, doesn't do very well. But yeah, it's definitely that incentivization and that supportiveness, but also consulting properly. And if you're trying to interact with a community, talk with the community that you're trying to interact with, rather than coming up with theories and models of how you're supposed to make the difference or make the change. Talk. Talk with them. Look to the research that's already been done. A lot of people ask, especially when it comes to things like outreach, are there any papers out about it? There are loads of papers out about this. And this is going back, spanning 50 years. And that's in the UK and in the US, showing the same things. So it comes to a point now, you've seen all this research. What are we going to do about it? And especially in academia, we are researchers by trade. So surely we should be able to see when these papers come out and disseminate the results and see what needs to be done. So yeah, it's very frustrating, if I'm honest with you. I think you can hear that. But yeah, it's not just financial, but in terms of scholarships for black students, how many UK-based black student scholarships, how many are there in our institutions? Where is that, I don't know, the emphasis being placed on getting people from UK institutions who've grown up in the UK, who've been raised in a system that does not help them and does not support them? And that scholarship doesn't necessarily have to be financial, but it will definitely help, because that will deal with some of the barriers. It's just looking at it with context. And I think a lot of academics are not doing that at the moment. They're not taking the time to actually look at these communities. And by that, I do not mean study them. I mean actually be in the community, talk to the community, and then you'll understand the problems that exist within the community and the barriers to access and how that can be alleviated.
Those are very, very valid points. And hopefully over time, your suggestions will be put into effect and that could have really significant changes. Is there anything else that you would like to speak on that we've not covered?
I guess I would say continue to watch this space. Outreach and access in general is something is very close to my heart, and it's something that I will definitely continue to do, even though it can be a burden sometimes, just because I do feel overstretched with the work that I do. Even the fact that I'm conducting research in 2 different cities is stressful enough. But yeah, I would say to watch this space on that front, watch a lot of the things that are going to be coming out through Imperial as one, through the Imperial Black Doctoral Network, which I mentioned beforehand, with their African Caribbean Research Collective, the West African Research Collective. Essentially, we're trying to just bring all these things together. And there will be a lot of outreach events coming. I guess it's COVID dependent, but a lot of them will be virtual too. We've got the YouTube videos coming out for the African Caribbean Research Collective. Funny enough, we'll also be on Pint of Science in September, which will be pretty cool. Yeah, so there's a lot in the pipeline, I would say. So essentially, connect with me and watch this space.
I can't wait to see what you and all these different groups achieve over the years. So we have come to the end of this podcast episode. Thank you for joining me, De-Shaine. I've learned a lot about access and outreach and how things can be done differently, and I'm sure our listeners have also taken a lot from this podcast. Please make sure you tune in to our next podcast episode, where I'll be speaking to Makinda Shahal, who is the Health Promotion and Intersectionality Lead at Trade Sexual Health, which is an LGBT organisation in Leicester, and we'll be speaking to him about how to engage the LGBT community in research. Thank you.